In this video, we're going to talk about objects and arrays, which are data structures in most modern compiled languages. Objects, they've become a primary concept in most programming languages that are used today. In fact, as we talked about in Module 1, these languages are often called object-oriented programming languages. That is, objects are central to what they do. Objects are a complex data type that are defined with multiple components that can be of any data type. If you remember back in Module 2, we talked about the math object. So that's a predefined object that has a whole bunch of methods. We're going to talk about the programming version of objects at length, but let's start with a human example. Just like real objects, digital objects that you code have properties, and they can perform actions, which we call methods. So in this example, properties would be things like the make, the model, the color of the car. Every car has those attributes, make, model, color, and so you could define those for every car around. So those would be the properties of the object car. Similarly, just like real objects, digital objects have methods, and as I mentioned, those are actions. And in this example, that would mean things like drive, accelerate, brake. So notice I'm using verbs there. Methods are things that you do. This is where that example of the math object comes in handy, because you can see things like math.random, which we've been using in our coding scenario. That's a thing that it does. So that's, random is basically a little function that just happens to be one of the methods that is contained within the object math. Now, getting back to our human example of the car, if you wanted to describe this object using code, considering the properties we talked about, it might look something like this. Here would be the properties, right? So car is a variable that includes these components, make, model, color, and you can see how you use the name of the property with a colon, and then you can put a value in there. In this case, we're putting a bunch of strings in there. Each one is separated by a comma. So this is how you would define an object in code. And as I mentioned, each of the elements is a property of the object car. New values could be assigned in each property individually using code that looks like this: car.make or car.model, car.color. So why use objects? Objects allow us to define complex data structures, keep information together that belongs together, and name and access our information intuitively. So basically, objects are one of those steps more towards the human in terms of thinking about programming languages as that mediation between how a computer thinks and how a human thinks, right? This is getting us towards the continuum of human, because when you have an object like car with properties like make, model, color, that is very intuitively understandable to people. If you read that code, that would be very understandable. So honestly, I really think that's one of the reasons that objects have become so central in programming. But the other thing I do want to talk about, I want to spend a little time on, because we're actually going to be using these in our code, is the idea of the array. So arrays are a special type of object. This type of object actually predates objects as a type of programming structure. So what I'm saying basically is that arrays came first, but objects became more popular. And so nowadays arrays are thought of as a type of object rather than thinking of arrays as the primary sort of structure. They basically use index numbers instead of labels like make and model and color to organize their members. So using a numbered index can be incredibly useful. You can initialize an array easily with for loop structures. You can use index math and preset methods to manipulate arrays in useful ways, and you can create multidimensional arrays. So a multidimensional array is essentially performing the same function as an object with a lot of properties. Multidimensional arrays are beyond the scope of this class. That's really more of a intermediate type thing. So I'm not going to get into that in a whole lot of detail here, but we are definitely going to be using arrays. So here's an example of some syntax for coding an array. So take a look at how that variable declaration is coded. You just have these square brackets. The square brackets mean this is going to have multiple members. It's going to be an array. So rather than expecting just a single string or a number or a Boolean value, this variable, cars, is going to expect to have multiple members. So then the next for loop there, that's going to initialize that array, basically put values into the different containers within cars. So for each index I, see cars, and then in square brackets I, we're going to call a function, and that function will presumably return some sort of value. So because we're counting from 0 to however many cars we want, and that's a parameter we're bringing into this function, all of those examples of car are going to get some value that's coming from get type in it. So you'll have cars square bracket 0 is equal to something, cars square bracket 1 is equal to something, cars square bracket 2 is equal to something, all the way up to how many. So that gives you a syntax example of initializing an array. This is going to make a lot more sense when we actually get into doing some coding, but I just wanted to give you a sense of the syntax of these two things and conceptually talk about them. So just to sum up, use objects if you want to have those intuitive labels that are basically words for your different properties, but use arrays if you're going to be doing some calculating in order to initialize and to use the different members. And you'll see what I mean by that as we continue on with the tutorials for this module.